Good morning, everyone. My name is Ann Nath. I'm the director of the University of Alberta Energy Systems Signature Area of Research and Teaching and of the Future Energy Systems Research Program. On behalf of the University of Alberta, the University of Texas at Austin, and the Tecnológico de Monterrey, I welcome all of you to today's webinar entitled The Mexican Energy Landscape: Perspectives from Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So the University of Alberta, the University of Texas at Austin, and the Tecnológico de Monterrey are leading research-intensive universities in their respective countries, each with very strong energy-focused expertise. The three universities are uniquely positioned to create a platform that enables discussion and analysis on energy policy through a North American perspective. We have started the North American Energy Dialogue, a three-part webinar series that will analyze the energy landscape in all three of our countries, starting today with a closer analysis of Mexico's energy reality. We have four experts here with us today, representing the School of Government and Public Transformation at Tec de Monterrey, the Jackson School of Geosciences at the University of Texas at Austin, and Export Development Canada. This promising discussion will be facilitated, and we are actually waiting for our moderator, but we do have Plan B. I'm going to introduce her. Her name is Veronica Irastorza. She's an associate director at NERA Consulting and has 20 years of experience in regulatory and strategic issues concerning energy. She was Undersecretary of Energy Planning and Transition in Mexico until December 2012, in charge of long-term planning and renewable energy and energy efficiency policies. So Veronica, have you joined us? If not, Plan B, over to you. You need to unmute.
Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you a lot for the University of Alberta and the Tec de Monterrey for this opportunity to be with you. Veronica, I'm sure, will join us at any moment. I'm not the moderator, but I'll be the proxy moderator while she arrives. I'm a professor at Tec de Monterrey at the Escuela de Gobierno and Transformación Pública of Tec de Monterrey. And I'll start by kicking out with a very brief presentation of how I see what happened in the last years of Peña Nieto's administration in energy and what's taking place right now in the current administration. I was an independent board member of PEMEX from October 12, 2014 till the beginning of this administration when I resigned. So I have some views about why it's so difficult to reform PEMEX. But let me start with a very, very quick overview. As you are very well aware, Mexico has had one, previous to the 2014 energy reform, Mexico had probably one of the closest energy sector in the world. So although Mexico is very usually associated with openness, even neoliberalism in the energy sector, the two dominant players in electricity, CFE was basically a monopoly, and PEMEX in all by any means was a monopoly. Everything from upstream to downstream was controlled by PEMEX. The reasons for these are long, and I won't go into them, but it more or less worked in a closed economy when the government had a margin of maneuver, fiscal margin of maneuver, and it started to become increasingly inefficient for two main reasons, I would argue. The first one is, of course, that these monopolies tend to be very unproductive, and both of them were very unproductive. The amount of money PEMEX has lost in refinery is amazing. I mean, if you look at the aggregate cost of losing in the refinery sector from the year 2000 to the year 2014 is almost like 70% of the total debt that PEMEX acquired, extra debt that Pemex acquired during that period. So it's a very inefficient company. CFE is perhaps less inefficient, but still, if you look at the comparative cost of what CFE costs in similar plants vis-a-vis the similar private sector plants, the difference is staggering. So Mexico had this very too inefficient plant in a context of fiscal restriction and very important in electricity, a change of economic model that would need ample and cheap energy for the manufacturing capacities that were being built in Mexico. And of course, we needed to plan, and Veronica is not here, but we needed to plan for the transition from carbon to less contaminant sources. So in that context, there was many efforts from the previous government to try to open the sector. It was impossible till Peña Nieto arrived. His reforms were really very ambitious in Mexican terms, but they weren't so ambitious in comparative terms, in the sense that there was no privatization of the two main assets. CFE and Pemex remain in the hands of the state, not even floating in shares, nothing like that. The name was changed. They became Empresas Productivas del Estado, productive firms of the state. There were many legal changes, but the control of the two firms remained strongly on the hands of the government. And secondly, the main asset, the main strategic assets remain on the hands of the government. In terms of electricity, the transmission and distribution network was controlled by the government. And in the case of oil, the reserves were clearly on the hands of the state. Now they would be allocated to the best bidder, something that was impossible to do in the past. Now Pemex will have competition across all the different sectors of the industry, but the major actors remain there. The reform was enacted in the year 2014, when the price of oil started to collapse dramatically. I arrived to the council in September of 2014, when the price of the oil was around 80, and a few months afterwards it was 40, and 10 months afterwards around 20. So it was an extremely complex transition for Pemex, trying to adapt to these new rules, to the competition, to start thinking strategically, not in terms of how much I produce, but on how much I earn, something that for Pemex is extremely difficult because all its metrics has been based historically on volume. And of course, Pemex had to face two extremely complex structural disadvantages. The first one was, of course, that Pemex was mounted in two extremely large fields, Cantarell and Kumalov-Sab. That's why Pemex became a major oil player. Massive fields. Cantarell is meant to be one of the 5 largest ever in the world, in relatively benign, easy conditions, shallow waters, no social conflict, relatively easy to manage, etc. Perhaps very poorly managed, but that's a different story. But the point is that it had to start substituting Cantarell and Kumalov-Sab. Cantarell used to produce by itself 2.2 million barrels in the year 2004, more or less, and now it's producing around 80,000, depending how you add it, but it's collapsed dramatically. And Kumalov-Sab, that is nowadays responsible for around 40% of the total of oil production of Pemex, that is around 1.6 million barrels, now produces around 40% of total oil production, and it's starting to collapse. We don't know how fast. So the reform was a massive shock for the two companies. They had serious complex legacies, such as excess workers, extremely complex labor relationships, very powerful trade unions, unpayable pensions, and things I think were moving slowly, but in the correct direction in terms of allowing more competition, having new players, making it more evident where the main competition, the main capacities of Pemex were lagging. But of course, López Obrador won with a very clear mandate, and the mandate was reversing energy reform. The interesting thing to bear in mind is that even though he has absolute control in legislative terms, he can change the law without any restriction. He has the majority in the two chambers, and his party is extremely disciplined. And he has been even able to change the constitution in most of the reforms he's pursued, because he just has to defeat as 1/3 of the senators that are in the opposition. And still, he didn't change the rules of the game. The constitution is the same one that was reformed by Peña. The secondary legislation hasn't been touched at all. And the president, for a variety of political reasons that I won't go into detail unless someone is interested, the president decided to do it through administrative changes and by controlling the regulators. In the reform, we created these very strong regulators, constitutionally non-independent from the CNE, from the Ministry of Energy, but with technical autonomy in such a way that if you look at the way fields were allocated through the Comisión Nacional de Hidrocarburos, it was an impressively well done process. Of course, they had to learn at the beginning to tweak a little bit the system, so we were sure we have a lot of attraction from private investors, but it worked. And if you look at the government take that Hacienda will get from these fields, it's equivalent, and in some cases even better than what it gets from similar fields in PEMEX. So in terms of managing the fiscal needs of the state, it was well done. The CRE, that regulates the access to competition in all the energy sector, was working relatively well. The Observador has decided to put these regulators under the control of the Mexican government, of the presidency, and basically the new rule of the game is no more competition. They have respected current contracts in the sense that none of these contracts has been wiped out, but even in any of the fields, some are more complex than others, the regulators are clearly not very open with respect to the needs of the private sectors. And in any new project, there's basically no space. They won't be tendering any more of the Mexican oil reserves. And the signals are that any new private project will be seen with enormous suspicion, because the logic of the government seems to be that any competition in the sector drains the resources of CFE and PEMEX, and they rather drain the consumer than drain the two major companies. The results so far haven't been spectacular by any means. If you look at the promises PEMEX and Hacienda have been making on what would be the level of recuperation of oil production, it just hasn't taken place. Production is going down, perhaps slowly compared to the past, but still there doesn't seem to be any obvious turning point. If you look at the PEMEX business plan, the turning point is dramatic. Nothing like that has happened yet. And they've decided to invest a lot of their extra capital in building a new refinery in Dos Bocas, Tabasco, that almost any expert believes to be a very poorly devised project, probably not needed. There's extra capacity of refinery products in El Golfo de Mexico, and PEMEX is usually much more productive in oil, in exploration and production than in refining products. So I think it's probably a way of sinking a lot of capital. But for López Obrador, the idea, and Isidro is going to discuss this with much more detail, the idea of soberanía energética, the idea that we don't have to import anymore gasoline for some strange reason, seems to be for him a very important issue. Quite surprisingly, because at the same time where we really are dependent and we really don't have any alternative is in the imports of gas from the US. And there seems to be no appetite, no desire to open the sector of conventional oil in northern Mexico that could create a competitive field similar to the one in Texas. I have to moderate myself because Veronica never appeared. I'm so sorry because she's a
No, I'm here, Carlos, sorry.
You are. So I don't have to. I was going to start speaking very highly of you, but now I'm just going to give you the mic because I was asked to speak for around 8 or 10 minutes. So Veronica, the floor is all yours. And thanks a lot. I'm very pleased to be with these very prestigious colleagues, and I'm looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. I'm very honored and also very happy to represent the women in energy so that all the students know that there's a lot of women here and don't get discouraged and come to the energy field. I don't want to spend a lot of time presenting people. I think maybe, I thought it was, there was a mix up with the time I thought it was at 10 in Mexico, but so I'm gonna go directly to ask some questions. And what Carlos was saying about the energy security and how this, there's a new trend for countries to look for energy independence. I wanted to ask the panelists here to comment about what they think about these views and how would that affect the country's policies, if you still think that North America can be an energy region or not. I don't know who wants to comment on this, maybe Isidro. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Veronica. In fact, I would like to jump to the discussion just in order to go in a little bit deeper on what Carlos said. Indeed, Mexico is going back to this concept of energy sovereignty. And I'm not going to repeat what he said very well, but I have to remind the audience that for Mexico, energy sovereignty is equivalent that the state must decide or must take the major energy decisions. And this has to be done through the two major state companies, which we know is PEMEX and CFE. And the major goal of this policy is to maintain self-sufficiency. That's a key concept. And as we know, historically, Mexico has maintained self-sufficiency, energy self-sufficiency during many years. At the same time, to supply energy needs through subsidies as a leverage tool vis-a-vis society, vis-a-vis consumers, vis-a-vis enterprises, vis-a-vis peasants, farmers, vis-a-vis residential consumers, vis-a-vis automobile users. So that's a key role because energy is a political tool, has been a political tool in Mexico for the state in order to have leverage vis-a-vis oil markets in terms of exports, vis-a-vis domestic consumers. Well, the key point I want to highlight now is that this model is passé. I mean, it's over. And because it has historically shown its limits. And at the same time, it cannot confront the new challenges Mexico is witnessing. And I'm going very quickly, if you let me, Veronica, to the limits. The two state energy enterprises cannot provide either economically or technically the growing demand of energy the country needs. For example, CFE currently provides almost half of total requirements of electricity, and we are importing more than 65% of natural gas consumption and 75% of gasoline consumption because PEMEX cannot supply the new needs. And this is not because of the energy reform of 2013, but it's because historically, those two companies cannot comply with those needs. And from that time to the present, different governments have identified, either from PAN or from PRI, have attempted to enlarge the participation of private capital. And Carlos explained very well how the reform finally opened different value chains, all value chains of the energy capital. And what was the goal? The goal was to end the monopoly state regime in order to increase national energy supply and abate imports. I mean, to address energy security constraints. And then this model, at the same time, is not only has shown its limits, but it's completely outdated. And as we know, during the past 20 years, Mexico has enacted new domestic legislation and subscribed international agreements, setting the country into the roadmap of an energy transition, that's very important, towards a low carbon economy in year 2050. Big commitments for a country which still consumes, as we know, 90% of fossil fuels. I want to just, for the sake of time, to name two major commitments we have now. To halve CO2 emissions in year 2050 compared to year 2000 levels, and to use 35% of clean fuels for the generation of power in the year 2024. These commitments match very well with the subscription of the Paris Agreement of 2015, as we know. And the goal is not only to improve resiliency as an energy reform, but most important of all, for me, to transit to a sustainable energy system in which common goods are preserved as clean and healthy, and our pool of energy sources are deployed for future generations. And so, for a second,
can just let me, we are gonna discuss more about the transition and the clean energy, but I just want to give a chance to Jorge Pinon. I wanted to ask him about Mexico's dependency on U.S. imported gas and gasoline, and to also tell us what he thinks about the region, and perhaps also if you can tell us about that, that would be great. And I've heard that you haven't been introduced yet, so let me just quickly tell, you can read their whole impressive bios on the website, but Jorge Pinon is the director of the Center for International Energy and Environmental Policy at UT Austin, and he has held many positions. Among them, he was the president of Amoco Oil. And I didn't introduce Isidro either, and thank you for all your comments, Isidro. He's a non-resident scholar at the Center for the United States and Mexico at the Baker Institute, and he's also a senior researcher and professor at ITESP. And Jorge Rabe, maybe you can comment after Jorge Pinon, but he's the chief representative for Mexico for EG Canada for export development. So welcome all. And so what can you tell us, Jorge, about the Mexican dependency on US fuels, on how would that change?
Well, thank you for having me. First of all, Veronica, let me go back to one, I believe it was your first comment earlier on, and also throw some comments to Carlos to start a real good Latin debate here among ourselves. And then I'll go into the dependency of the US. Number one, it is extremely myopic and naive for any country to think that they can really become energy independent. That just doesn't exist. No country today in the world can live on an island that is self-sufficient as far as energy, because it's not economic efficiently. Today, oil, natural gas, and even electricity are true fungible commodities that are traded around the world. So if you look at the major oil corporations, if you look at an Exxon, for example, Exxon only refines about 10% of the same crude that it produces. Why? Because it makes better, it's smarter to trade that crude, sell it, and buy crude that is efficiently run at its refineries. So what the system is looking for is economic efficiency, and no country by itself can accomplish economic efficiency. Let me throw something also for a comment. I think the Mexico energy reform was inherently doomed. It was set to fail the first day that came into effect for two main reasons. Number one, they never re-engineered PEMEX. The first step should have been to make PEMEX more or less competitive so that it could face the challenge of the major oil companies was going to come in, that came into the country. PEMEX could not have been in re-engineering a year. It would have taken a whole sexennial in order to accomplish that. So number one, you cannot throw PEMEX, and here we're criticizing PEMEX, and don't get me wrong, it has inherently many mistakes, but we threw PEMEX to the wolves with their hands tied behind their back. The financial burden, the financial structure of PEMEX, all of that should have been addressed before the energy reform came into effect. The second problem that Mexico had is that the energy reform raised expectations. The general public did not understand that when you go into an offshore project to develop its resources, it takes anywhere between 5 to 7 years to monetize those resources. And the people in Mexico, the Mexican in the street, I think in a way believe that the energy reform was going to show results immediately. That did not happen. So those are two major problems, raise expectations, and also that PEMEX was not competitively fit to join the group of international oil companies. Yes, Mexico today, for example, 43% of US natural gas exports go to Mexico. 22% of our refinery products exports go to Mexico. By the way, it's about 1 million barrels a day of refined products, particularly gasoline and diesel. So regrettably, in a way, Mexico's situation today, and what we think that situation will continue, is beneficial to the US. Last year, 91% of our refineries utilization rate in the US Gulf Coast was thanks to the Mexico demand. And then my last comment on Dos Bocas and a new refinery. The last grassroots full complexion refinery that was built in the United States was in Garyville, Louisiana in 1976. At that time, our refinery capacity, Veronica, here in the US was 15 million barrels a day. Today is 19 million barrels a day with having built one single grassroots refinery. What we did, we debottlenecked the existing refinery system, we increased conversion capacity, we took advantage of the infrastructure that was already built, and that's how efficiently we came to be today as far as our conversion capacity. I think Dos Bocas is a major strategic mistake. All of that effort and all of that money should have been spent on the existing refineries to debottleneck the system. To finish up, I think dependency on US natural gas and dependency on US refined products will continue throughout this sexennial, at least for the next 5 to 6 years.
Yeah, thank you, Jorge. I agree. And I wanted to let Carlos comment on this because I don't know if, Carlos, you were properly, if they read your bio here, but PEMEX was, Carlos was part of the board of PEMEX. He was one of the first independent board members. So I want him to comment on what he thinks that PEMEX changes should look like and the main challenges, because I also worked for PEMEX and it's not easy to move a company like that big and with so many, so much historic load. So go ahead, Carlos.
Thank you, Veronica. Jorge, now the discussion becomes very interesting. I'm basically in agreement with almost everything you said. And I'm even in agreement with your basic proposition, but the problem is that it was impossible to do it that way. Of course, you can imagine a much better scenario. You take 6 years, make PEMEX competitive, hire the best people available, and then you open it for competition. But this is Mexico, this is not China. It's politically so complex, and Veronica probably can tell us some of the stories she must have lived in the board of PEMEX. It's so difficult to control PEMEX. It's been historically a complex fight between Hacienda and PEMEX, the trade union, that the only way, I think, of trying to make PEMEX more efficient was through the shock of competition. But as I said, it wasn't such much of a shock. PEMEX got almost all the resources, 1P resources that existed in Mexico, 80% of the 2P. It has the control over all the networks, most of the facilities for importing gasoline, etc. So it wasn't in such a complex, I mean, it was very complex, but it has several advantages for competing in Mexico vis-a-vis these foreign firms. But once the reform was done, of course, we should have had a much better director, a director with much more capacity to strategically think what was important. As you are very well aware, we started buying fertilizing plants, which was a complete stupid thing to do. We were planning extremely complex deep water investments in gas, which made no sense. We were carrying a very expensive debt, and the Hacienda should have helped us much more. When the price of the oil collapsed, we had no support from Hacienda. We were even charged a couple of dividends in 2 of the years. So Pemex conditions weren't optimal, but it was impossible to first strengthen Pemex and then politically and then open Pemex. And of course, all reforms in the world are usually oversold. I would ask you to tell me one reform in the world that hasn't been oversold, because if you don't oversell them, you never do it. But of course, the problems that Pemex currently has won't be solved by just shielding it from competition again. I think it will just make things worse, because they are again focusing in production and not in generating cash. And the amount of money they are pouring into refining, not only Dos Bocas, but in maintenance and trying to process more crude, I think it's, as you said, a major strategic and financial mistake.
Yeah, and we are gonna, Isidro, I know that you want to comment on this, and I'll give you a chance, and we'll come back to this topic. But we've been talking mainly about the U.S. and Mexico, and I wanna hear what Jorge Rabe thinks about the Canada as well, because Canada has been really important, especially in the pipeline sector in Mexico. And I wanted to ask you, Jorge, what do you think will be the effect of the new agreement in terms of investments, and what do you, like, if you see still opportunities for Canada to invest in Mexico, if you see projects going forward, if you are still investing, given all these challenges that we're seeing now in Mexico?
Yes, hi, Veronica. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to the University of Alberta for considering having EDC here. So it's great. This is a fantastic conversation. Let me quickly mention 3 points. The first one is that EDC has been in Mexico for 20 years physically. We have been doing business. Our first loan to Pemex goes back to 1978. CFE also, we've had a long-standing relationship with them. That has brought benefit to a lot of Canadian companies, including, of course, Alberta-based companies like TransCanada and some others. So there was one interesting question that you mentioned before, and I'm just going to quickly mention that before I go into your question about the importance for Canada. So you were asking about whether or not a deeper regional energy integration would be possible, and my short answer is it is. We think it is, but provided that there is investor and service provider, that those companies have a predictable framework and clear rules of the game. That's the essence of any long-term investor. Jorge mentioned something that I think is quite significant and quite important, and is that usually the investments are not going to be profitable from, it's not an overnight success, and that we most of us know about that. So what we have seen and what we saw come as a result of NAFTA for the past 25 years was significant improvements in terms of the fight against corruption, the fight against government interference, clearer rules of the game, of course, and we expect that under CUSMA, the Canadian version of the agreement, which of course, you know, has 3 different names, but we like to call it CUSMA in Canada, that we are going to see more improvement going forward. Our Canadian ambassador to Mexico appeared before the Senate last week, and the message was very clear, and I think that the message is essentially that Canada is trying to offer and has been offering Mexico a win-win relationship. We want transparency, we want security, we want social inclusion for the benefit of the citizens of Mexico, of course. Our Canadian companies, and you mentioned the case of TransCanada, have been fully invested using actually their own balance sheet in many cases in making sure that investments in terms of building infrastructure are there without having to use any of the funds from companies like CFE, for example, and the PDRGAS. The Obra Pública Financiada system was quite successful in allowing for that. But we also need to see, and we need to ensure that the Canadian investors are benefiting from a predictable business environment. At this point, unfortunately, and Mexico is making a decision to and a clear commitment to PEMEX and to CFE, and that is great. It's offering a lot of opportunities for service providers, but at the same time, it's bringing a lot of challenges for Canadian companies and Canadian investors. Pension funds are very interested in Mexico. They're still fully committed. And what we see, for example, in the case of the renewable space, which is happening to be and happens to be a quite important factor in allowing Mexico to become the manufacturing hub in a post-COVID world and in a post-COVID scenario. Canadian investment in renewables, it's beyond $3 billion. That's quite an investment that any market and any country should try to take very good care of by giving them the permits that those companies need, and as a result of their investments after the energy reform of 2013-2014. So those are the key points there. I think that I will just stop there in case there's any other comments or questions, but in essence, if I could leave the attendance and the attendees with a comment, is that EDC is still committed to Mexico. We're still trying to make sure that there are success stories for Canadian investors and also for the Canadian service providers through our various managed products that we have in Canada and in Mexico as well.
Okay, thank you. Now, going back to Isidro, you wanted to comment something on the PEMEX discussion, and I also wanted to move the conversation because Jorge and also you mentioned about the renewables and sustainability, and I wanted to see what you think. You know, I feel that Mexico is moving the other way. Like there has been a lot of measures to that damage renewable energy projects in Mexico, and that is going to be a challenge going forward. But also I wanted to see what you think about what will happen, or if the US elections would have an effect on this in Mexico. If you think if Biden wins, it would put more pressure on Mexico or not. What are your views? So go ahead.
Thank you, Veronica. In fact, that's the point. I mean, we have to move to that point in the sense that the major challenge is how North America, Canada, US, and Mexico are going to guarantee future energy needs of the continent. And the future of energy demand is not on fossil fuels, it's on electricity. And the key point is how to produce electricity. And you address a point in the sense that in the current presidential campaign in the US, the debate is between going back to fossil fuels and to leave the Paris Agreement, or to the contrary, as Joe Biden says, to go for a new green deal or a green plan and to rejoin the Paris Agreement and to become a leader of energy transition. And that's, for me, a key point in all North America. Canada is, in some way, is more advanced than the US and Mexico, at least in some provinces than others. But in the case of Mexico, we have a backlash because we are, as I said, we are recarbonizing the economy in spite of that the energy reform also legislated in favor of energy transition in Mexico. As I said, Mexico has committed to halve CO2 emissions to year 2050 and to produce power with 35% of clean fuels in year 2024. I mean, so those are Mexico's commitment, and they are framed through the reform, Jorge Pinon. The reform is very complex. It has also enacted Mexico's transition, but it has been stopped, as you correctly say, Veronica, because now with a new, with the capture of regulators, with a new, with the coming back to this approach of energy sovereignty, in which the state has the last decision in terms of energy policies, and in which the state must come back to the monopoly regime in terms of energy supply. I mean, this has put everything in a great uncertainty, as Jorge Rabe says. So the challenge for Mexico, as the challenge for North America, is how to move in order to boost renewable energy, especially in the power sector, but also in the transport sector. I mean, to transit to more electronic cars, to more
transport. You know, just like in terms of electricity, I was yesterday looking at data, and it's amazing how little trade there is between the US and Mexico, and that's not new. It's not just because of the new government. This is a historical reality that is just negligible. Exactly. And it's amazing how many challenges there are for the electricity trade. So
it's marginal, and I want to just to jump a little bit to the question of what Jorge said. And instead, we are importing more and more gas, and we'll keep importing gas in order to produce our electricity. The only way to curb those imports is to boost our domestic natural gas supply, which we have, and to allow renewable energy to enter in the production of power.
Yeah. So Jorge or Carlos, do you want to comment on this?
I actually had a comment, Veronica, very quickly, because I think it's important to remember one thing, and going back to something that Carlos also actually mentioned before. No government will be able to, especially one like the López Obrador administration that has shown such commitment to austerity measures even in the face of COVID. No government will be able to do anything on their own without counting with the private sector and allowing the private sector to come in. I'm just going to give you an example, and I was chatting with few fellow bankers over the past few days, and most bankers and most international banks will agree that at this point, one of the key requirements is to ensure that projects are bankable. The interest is there. The investors and the project sponsors are there, and they're fully committed to Mexico. They have actually done tremendous work for the past 6 or 7 years trying to get their things ready for the possibility of generating electricity using the grid to sell to private companies, and we're seeing the cases. I'm sure that we don't need to go over that. But the most important thing at this point is that we have that certainty and that investor confidence so that projects can become bankable, that banks have the confidence that permits that are needed and required to make sure that those projects reach COD and are able to get to the finish line, are that those permits are there. That's the key. Especially in an environment where the government wants to continue with their austerity measures, that tandem with the private sector is key and is fully important for the development of the sector.
Yeah, that's another interesting point that I wanted to discuss. Maybe there won't be time for all the topics, but I was reading that BlackRock is now weighting the climate change risk, and JP Morgan just committed with the Paris Agreement. So the sustainability is also related to the financing, and this might be another like a pressure to move in the
And it's something that
energy
at some
transition.
point will be key when you look at projects that may not always have the environmental permits, for example, or the social license to operate. That's
Yeah.
something that the government also needs to consider when thinking about these huge, very important projects for obviously for their national agenda. But at the same time, keeping in mind that the bankability of the projects will continue to be essential, and also to allow them to meet their agreements, the climate change agreements. Of course, most banks, and EDC is not obviously not an exception there. Most banks are now fully committed to a very aggressive decarbonization agenda, of course, and that's something that, as you say, we won't have time to cover today, but something that I also wanted to mention.
Yeah. So Carlos, go ahead.
Thank you, Veronica. I will add to what Jorge said, which is the other side of the coin, which is those that need energy. I mean, if you look at the uncertainties that has created all this regulation for major consumers of electricity that had already some sort of plan, to be capable of having cheaper energy, cheaper electricity, in many cases, cleaner electricity. And now they are very worried that maybe it's better to return to CFE, even though it's more expensive, and they know that the carbon print is very large. So they're really unraveling the market very efficiently, I would say, through this very clear control over the regulatory agencies and this very clear objective of, for example, producing more, refining more products, and therefore producing more fuel oil that has to be burned by someone, and that needs to change the rules of how do you connect the electricity plant. So it's really a major disaster in many aspects.
Yes. Yes, I agree. Jorge, Isidro, if you want, we don't have a lot of time, so I ask you to be brief, please.
Yeah, just one comment. I think conversations that we have had here in Texas among a number of investors, everybody believes that AMLO will continue the status quo vis-a-vis the contracts that have been awarded so far, at least on the downstream sector. I think the big question that we have here is what is going his position to be once the midterm elections in June take place. And I think that is the next horizon that everybody is looking at. In the short term, between now and June, we believe that this administration is not going to push back on any of the existing contracts that have been awarded and somehow guarantee the continuation of those contracts. And like Carlos says, just tinker with regulatory issues and administrative issues in order to manage this nationalistic strategy that he has toward the energy sector. But the big question that we have is June of 2021. What is going to happen after that? Is that going to give him new impetus really to then move forward and either postpone or take over or change the rules of the game? So right now, for the next few months until June, we believe the status quo will continue. At least that's the opinion of most folks out there. And everybody's waiting to see what happens post June midterm elections in Mexico.
Thank you. Yeah, Carlos, go ahead.
Thank you, Veronica. I think that Jorge has, basically I will agree with you, Jorge, in the sense that formally the status quo will continue, but the actual texture of this status quo will continue to deteriorate. That is to say, they will respect the contract, but you'll start facing increasingly new hurdles to do whatever you have to do. But I think that's the basic mandate of the regulatory agency. Put the case of the Yenova project to re-export gas from the US and then to put gas into the duct, to the pipe that goes to Ensenada and then re-export this gas. You only need a permit of SENER. That's the only thing you need. It doesn't really compete with anyone of PEMEX. But no, they haven't said yes. And instead of that, if you look at the infrastructure projects that were presented on Monday, one of the projects is a plant for liquefying gas in Salina Cruz, which makes no sense, is extremely expensive, has been thought before and discharged before, So I would be slightly less optimistic with respect what does the statu quo means. And
another Dos Bocas.
Different kind, but similar to. And I don't think it won't fly. I think it won't fly. But the second thing is, for AMLO, the current capacity to change the constitution with virtually no restriction won't get better in the 22 election. I think that if he hasn't changed the rules of the game in the energy reform, has to do more, Veronica, and I would like perhaps to discuss that, I'm no expert, with PEMEC, with the US. And you asked something about what would be the impact of a likely Biden victory in the US. What are the restrictions that US MEC implies? I would be interested in understanding better what are the external restrictions, because AMLO had no internal restriction for reforming the constitution and returning to the articles prior to Peña Nieto's reform. And even if he performs well in the year 21, he will be more or less as he is now, which for me, it's currently the less likely scenario. I think that the most likely scenario is that he would lose the ample majority that allows him to, at the Chamber of Deputies, reform the Constitution by itself. But let's see what happens.
Yeah. Okay, Isidro, go ahead. We have just like 5 minutes.
I agree with Carlos in the sense that the status quo will be maintained, but it will deteriorate. And a possibility of change could come from a crisis. As we in Mexico know how to change, we change through crisis. The only thing, or only way to avoid that crisis, or anticipate that crisis, is a major political change in the US. And as we know, Joe Biden has a green plan, and the Democrats said that they will put a tax on imports which have which are carbon intensive, meaning by that Mexican imports can be taxed. So perhaps through these mechanisms and the implementation of CUSMA, as Jorge said, guaranteeing private investments in the energy sector, which are protected according to CUSMA, will be one way to move, to shift from the status quo by avoiding a crisis. And of course, we need a strong civil society. We need to put in the political agenda in Mexico energy transition. That's extremely important. Otherwise, we're not going to move the society.
Okay, I think we just have 5 minutes. So if any of you wants to say like any closing remarks, but I think we all agree on this panel that Mexico will need private investments, and probably many of them will come from the US and Canada, and that they need certainty to be at a reasonably financeable, and that the treaty should protect some of these investments. And there are many challenges in Mexico. Jorge, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I have a quick question for my Mexican friends, and that is, are we convinced that unconventionals in northern Mexico, at least through hydraulic fracking, is out of the picture? End of story.
Very easily, yes.
Yeah, for the time being, is out of story because it's cheaper to import from Texas, and we don't pay the cost of cleaning.
No, I don't think it's a problem.
The land and the environment.
I don't think it's an economic problem. It's a political problem. AMLO strongly believes that fracking is against nature or whatever. He's a very contradictory figure, of course. He can do those bocas and at the same time criticize eolic generation because it looks bad at the Sierra in Baja California. So because AMLO doesn't want fracking, fracking won't take place.
Yeah, sorry, Carlos, I agree with you. And I wanted to say that fracking hasn't happened outside the US, and that's for many reasons. Among them is Napoleon, that the property rights for everything underneath the land in most countries is owned by the state and not the farmers or the owners of the land. So I think that has been a key difference for the US.
The other reason that I asked Veronica and Carlos is not only because of natural gas, but also because of the liquids and the petrochemical sector. We haven't talked, we can spend a whole day here having this conversation because another one of the important pillars of Mexico and of PEMEX are petrochemicals. And one of the questions I think that we have is where are petrochemical goings and what is the future of the petrochemicals market for Mexico due to the lack of gas and due to the lack of gas liquids like ethane, for example.
We need another panel for that.
We need another hour for each of these topics, I think.
Veronica, if I could just share something very quickly, I think just to leave and to reinforce our point, EDC since 2015 we've been doing business with a service provider to PEMEX, which is called Cotemar, and I think the Cotemar example is quite interesting for this in this case in the oil and gas space. They were able to take and inherit a PEMEX well that was producing around 500 barrels a day, and they brought it up to 3,000. And I know 3,000 doesn't sound like a lot, but if we have many of these small stories, and we were able to replicate some of these small stories, then that's probably a better success, grandiose success story to tell. And the other thing that I just want to say, just to conclude, is Mexico has probably the resources as not a lot of countries, great potential in renewables. Very few countries have the resources in terms of wind, solar, as Mexico does. And again, at this point, and I don't want to be repetitive, but what Canadian investors are asking is those that are already there, like a lot of the pension funds, and that those the $3 billion that I mentioned before, they're asking for certainty and investors' confidence, and that the risk at this point is higher than before. We want to make sure that we are still committed to making and creating success stories in Mexico. We just want to see a little bit of some of the government attitudes meeting the investors midway, so that we can continue bringing some of that success to the Mexican market and to make Mexico be a greater part of the North America story in terms of energy generation and creation.
Thank you, Jorge. I think we need to wrap up. I hope we can get another hour soon to discuss more. But I think Christian, or I don't know who from the university is gonna wrap up or wanted to say something.
That will be.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think all of the conversation still ongoing and all of the points yet to be made really bodes well for the importance of this webinar series. So thank you to the panelists and the moderator for this enriching discussion on Mexico's energy landscape, the opportunities and challenges that lie ahead. And I thank all of you who joined us this morning for the first webinar of the North American Energy Dialogue. So I invite you to stay tuned for the next webinars of our series that will look a little bit more closely at Canada and the United States. So as I end, a special acknowledgement for the work of our partners at the Tec de Monterrey, Dr. Luis Serra of the Energy Initiative, the University of Texas at Austin, Dr. John Butler at the K. Haley Hutchison Center for Energy, Law, and Business, the University of Alberta International, Christian Gonzalez Pais, and the Energy Systems Programs at the University of Alberta. Thank you, and see you at the next webinar.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.